Hello and welcome back to A Level Biology Help. Today I'm going to take you through the Control of Heart Rate section for AQA A Level Biology. Also, at the end of the video, I'll be going through a few exam-style questions and explaining their mark schemes. Also, as always, there will be timestamps to the different sections in the video in the comments, so if you do not wish to watch the whole thing, you can just skip to the sections that you wish to study or revise from. Right, so let's get straight into it. So the heart, human heart rather, is myogenic. This means that it relies on muscular contraction. However, the rate at which a heart muscle contracts, so if I just get my pen tool out, so the rate, key term here is rate, at which the heart muscle contracts is controlled by waves of electrical activity. So you might have heard about this before, as when the heart stops, which is a cardiac arrest, this is when the electrical activity is disrupted. So rate is controlled by the waves of electrical activity. But the main focus of the video today is how are these waves of electrical activity conducted, and how do they cause contraction? So the first part of the heart that causes electrical activity is called the Sinoatrial Node, or the SAN. Now, before I begin to explain about this, if you're unfamiliar with the different parts of the heart, the structure of the heart, or the cardiac cycle, please go and check out my video about mass transport in animals, which will be in the corner of the screen. Now, that is quite a long video, but you can skip to the sections that contain information about the cardiac cycle in the timestamps, which will be in the comments of that video. So the Sinoatrial Node, or the SAN, is located in the right atrium, as shown here by the diagram. What the Sinoatrial Node does is that it releases a wave of depolarization. Now, don't really worry if you are not familiar with the term depolarization, because this will be covered in much more detail in the nerve impulses section. So if you want to know it now, however, depolarization is something that happens when there is an influx of sodium ions into the neurons as the positive charge increases. So this is called depolarization, and depolarization allows electrical impulses to be carried throughout the nervous system. So the sinoatrial node releases a wave of depolarization, or electrical impulses, across the atria. So across the atria. This means that the atria contracts. And if you are familiar with the cardiac cycle, atrial contraction causes the flow of blood into the ventricles. The next step is that the wave of depolarization released by the sinoatrial node reaches the Atrioventricular Node, or the AVN, which is this bit here. So it's quite close to the sinoatrial node. So the wave of depolarization, or the electrical signal, is transferred to the AVN. So what does the AVN then do? So here we have another image of the AVN and then the sinoatrial node connected to it. So the wave of depolarization travels along here to the AVN. So what does the AVN do? The AVN releases another wave of depolarization, so another electrical signal. This occurs when the first wave from the sinoatrial node reaches it. Now, the key thing to note here is that there is a non-conductive layer between the atria and the ventricles. So in this image, you can probably imagine a non-conductive layer here, as the ventricles are situated here in this diagram and the atria are here. So this non-conductive layer prevents waves of depolarization travelling down to the ventricles. If the non-conductive layer didn't exist, then the wave of depolarization would reach the ventricles. This would be detrimental, as this would cause premature contraction of the ventricles, so insufficient volumes of blood will be delivered to the pulmonary artery or the aorta. So insufficient volumes of blood will be delivered to the body, which will be devastating for respiration. So the next thing that happens is that the wave of depolarization released by the AVN is transferred to the bundle of His, or the His bundle, which is this section here. The bundle of His then transmits the wave down the septum, which is this here, so the wave travels down here. So the wave hits the apex of the heart, which is the bottom, and it is then transferred to the Purkinje fibers, which are these fibers here. These kind of tree-like structures here. So these are the Purkinje fibers. So the wave of depolarization is transferred here. Now these Purkinje fibers are situated in the ventricle walls. So this would make the ventricle walls contract. However, before ventricular contraction actually occurs, there is a delay. There is a delay whilst the AVN transmits a second wave of depolarization, so not the first one that we have mentioned here, but a second one. This allows enough time for the atria to pump all blood into the ventricles. So for all of the blood to enter the ventricles, two waves of depolarization are required. If this delay didn't exist, then insufficient volumes of blood will be pumped out of the ventricles into the pulmonary artery or the aorta. And this will be, again, devastating for respiration cases. So after this delay, the apex, so the bottom of the heart, and then the ventricle walls contract, allowing the release of blood into the blood vessels, so the pulmonary artery and the aorta. So it says here that apex and then the ventricle walls contract. So the contraction kind of goes upwards, as the apex is the bottom of the heart. After this happens, so after the contraction, the cardiac muscles relax, as the cells in the heart are repolarized. So this means that a resting potential is achieved again. So the cardiac muscle relaxes. Again, if you're unfamiliar with the terms depolarization, repolarization, etc., do not worry, this will be covered in more detail and it will become easier once I do a video on nerve impulses. So the next thing we're going to focus on is how heart rate is controlled due to different stimuli. So heart rate changes due to factors such as exercise, pressure, pH, etc., etc. Heart rate is controlled by a center in the brain called the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata in the brain controls the heart rate via the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system carries signals to the medulla oblongata, which then transfers signals back to the sinoatrial node to control heart rate. So here we have an image of the brain with the medulla oblongata here. The crucial thing to note is that the medulla oblongata has two centers. So shown here, there are two centers, one here and one here. So there are two main centers. One of the centers increases heart rate via the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is part of the autonomic nervous system. So the first center increases heart rate via the sympathetic nervous system that is linked to the SAN. The second center is something that decreases heart rate via the parasympathetic nervous system. So now we're going to focus on the different stimuli and how that affects heart rate. So let's begin. So the first stimuli that we're going to talk about is increased pressure. So the first step is that the increased pressure is detected by pressure receptors, and these receptors are located in the walls of the aorta and the carotid artery. The carotid artery, you might already know, is one of the main arteries that runs up your neck. Now, if you are unfamiliar with receptors, please check out my video on receptors in the corner. So the next step is that the electrical impulses sent by the stimulated pressure receptors are sent to the medulla oblongata, and then the signals are sent back to the sinoatrial node when they have been processed by the medulla oblongata via the parasympathetic nervous system. And the next step, which is the final step, is this results in a decrease in frequency of electrical signals, so the heart rate decreases. So increased pressure decreases the heart rate, as if the heart rate stayed the same, the blood will be delivered at too high pressures, so this would cause blood vessels to burst. So the decrease in heart rate makes sure the blood vessels do not burst. So the impulses are sent along the parasympathetic nervous system. So increased pressures cause electrical signals to be sent along the parasympathetic nervous system. As I said a couple of minutes ago, that the parasympathetic nervous system is mainly used for the decrease in heart rates. So now we're going to talk about when pressure is decreased. So when pressure is decreased, the first step is the same. So the decreased pressure, which is the stimulus, is detected by pressure receptors again in the aorta and the carotid artery. Impulses sent by the pressure receptors are then sent to the medulla oblongata again, and then back to the sinoatrial node again. However, this time this is via the sympathetic nervous system. And then the final step is that there is an increase in the frequency of electrical signals this time in the heart. So heart rate increases. This ensures that blood is delivered to, or oxygenated blood is delivered to respiring tissues at an optimal rate, as a low pressure would mean that not as much oxygen is being delivered to them, so respiration will suffer. So now we are going to focus on decreased pH levels, which I think is the last factor that we are going to talk about today. So decreased pH levels happen due to exercise. pH decreases amongst exercise as a high respiration rate due to exercise increases production of carbon dioxide and lactic acid. Now, if you watched my video about mass transport in animals, especially the hemoglobin section, you would know that when carbon dioxide is absorbed in blood or dissolved in blood, carbonic acid is produced, which is obviously acidic, so pH decreases. So the first step in decreased pH levels is that it is detected by chemoreceptors in the aorta and carotid artery. So don't get confused between pressure receptors and chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors are used for chemical changes, so pH levels, for example. So chemoreceptors are in the same area as the pressure receptors, so the aorta and the carotid artery. The next step is that the impulses sent by the chemoreceptors are then sent to the medulla oblongata again, and then back to the sinoatrial node via the sympathetic nervous system. To decrease pH levels, send impulses along the sympathetic nervous system. And the final step is this increases frequency of electrical signals in the heart, as the SAN has received the electrical signals from the medulla oblongata. This means that heart rate increases. Now, the main reason why heart rate increases as a response to decreased pH levels, is that this means that more or higher volume of blood is being delivered to the lungs. This means that carbon dioxide is removed more efficiently. If carbon dioxide wasn't removed, this will be detrimental as the pH levels would denature important enzymes in the body. Right, so that is it for the content. Now I'm going to get on to a few exam style questions. So if I just get my highlighter tool out. So let's look at the first question. A frog's heart was attached to an instrument which measured the force produced as the heart contracted. Graph 1 shows the changes in force when the heart was bathed in a solution of salts at 20 degrees Celsius. Graph 2 shows the results when the heart was bathed in the solution at the same temperature but including acetylcholine. So here we have both graphs measuring heart rate, so the time in seconds and the force. And graph 1 is when no acetylcholine is present, but graph 2 is when we have acetylcholine. So let's look at the question. So the question says points A and B, so A, B here, and A and B here. So points A and B show when the atria and the ventricle were contracting. Which point, A or B, shows contraction of the ventricle? Give 2 reasons for your answer. So as you can see from both graphs, B is present at a higher force. This will suggest that B shows contraction of the ventricle, as obviously the ventricles have to contract harder as it is delivering blood to either the pulmonary artery, which goes to the lungs, or the aorta, which goes to the whole body. However, the atria only pumps blood to the ventricles, so ventricle contraction requires more force. So we can say that point B shows contraction of the ventricle. So as I've said, reason 1 could be B is the second contraction that occurs, as atrial contraction occurs before ventricular contraction. So A is the first contraction that occurs, as you can see. Second reason is that the force is larger, which obviously shows ventricular contraction, as ventricular contraction requires more force. So let's look at the mark scheme. So it says B, so we'll get that mark, because it is the second contraction, or you can put it occurs immediately after A, or just that it occurs after the atrium. We put that it is the second contraction, so we would get that mark. Also, the second marking point says larger, or more force, or more pressure. We put the force is larger, so we would get the second mark. So we would get both marks for this question. Right, so let's move on to the next question. So it says, calculate the frog's heart rate when acetylcholine was not present. Show your working. So for this question, I've just pasted the graph where acetylcholine was not present. So to do this, you need to look at the time it takes for one contraction to occur. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 contractions. So if I just get my pen tool out. So first we need to figure out how long a full contraction lasts. So a full cycle lasts, sorry. So here we have it starts here. And if we read along the x-axis, each mini square here counts for 0.2 seconds. So the cardiac cycle here starts at 0.6. And the cycle ends when it is flat here. And the cycle ends here at 2.2. Sorry for the messy handwriting. So first we need to figure out the difference between 2.2 and 0.6 to figure out the length of the beat. So 2.2 minus 0.6 is, if my calculations are right, 1.6. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to divide 60 by 1.6. This is because the units in the answer are in beats per minute, and there are 60 seconds in 1 minute. So we need to write that it is 60 seconds, as the time is measured in seconds here on the x-axis. So 60 divided by 1.6 is 37.5, rounded to 3 significant figures. So this is what our heart rate is. So our final answer is heart rate equals 37.5 beats per minute. So let's look at the mark scheme. So the mark scheme says 60 divided by time for 1 cycle, which we calculated to be 1.6, so we would get 1 mark here. And the answer would be 37 to 38. So you could put any answer in between these two numbers here. We've got 37.5, which is in between 37 and 38, so we would get the second mark. So we would get all 2 marks for this question. However, here it says allow 1 mark if the correct working is shown. So if you got the wrong answer, but your working was correct, you can get 1 mark. But you can't get 2 marks as your answer was wrong. So let's look at the next question. So the next question says, from the graphs, what can you conclude about the effect of acetylcholine on heart rate and then stroke volume? So if we compare the graphs for heart rate, you can see that when acetylcholine is present, there is a lower heart rate as there are less cycles. So when acetylcholine is present, there are only 3 cycles, but when no acetylcholine is present, there are 5. So this is what I've written for heart rate. Heart rate is reduced when acetylcholine is added. So the second part of the question wants to ask you about stroke volume. Obviously, when acetylcholine is present, the heart rate decreases. However, the stroke volume is not affected, as the same amount of blood is, or same volume of blood is delivered, but the rate is different. So the stroke volume here is not affected, as the volume of blood is the same. So let's look at the mark scheme. So for the heart rate, it is reduced, and for stroke volume, it is not affected. So we would get both marks at this question. Let's look at the next question. The next question says, use your answer to part I to explain the effect of acetylcholine on cardiac output. So part I, we said that heart rate was reduced, but stroke volume was not affected. So we need to explain the effect of acetylcholine on cardiac output. Now recall that cardiac output means heart rate multiplied by stroke volume. So if you do the maths, this means that if we have a decreased heart rate, the cardiac output is going to be reduced, no matter what the stroke volume is. So this is what I've written. Decrease in the cardiac output because the heart rate has decreased. So the next part of the question asks, addition of acetylcholine in the experiment mimics the effect of one branch of the autonomic nervous system. Which branch is this? So, as we said before, acetylcholine decreases heart rate, and as we said earlier in the video, a decreased heart rate is associated with the parasympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic nervous system is the branch of the autonomic nervous system that deals with decreasing heart rate. So let's look at the mark scheme. So the first part of our question says it is reduced because of cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume, or you can write a connection argument based on reduced heart rate. We wrote a connection argument based on reduced heart rate as we put decrease because heart rate is decreased. So we have written a connection argument there, so we would get that mark. And the second part of the question is parasympathetic, so we wrote that, so we would get that mark again. So this is the next part of the question. Explain how nervous control in a human can cause increased cardiac output during exercise. As this is an explain question, you don't just put what occurs, you need to explain why something is occurring. So this is what I've written. I've written that there is coordination or control of the heart rate via the medulla oblongata, which is in the brain. Then the medulla oblongata increases impulses, and these are sent along the sympathetic nervous system to the sinoatrial node. This leads to an increase in electrical impulses sent from the sinoatrial node. Now I've referred to the sympathetic nervous system here because an increase in cardiac output is associated with a higher heart rate. And as I said earlier, higher heart rate is associated with sympathetic nervous systems. So let's look at the mark scheme. So the first marking point says coordination or control of the stimulus of the heart rate by the medulla, or you can write medulla oblongata, but you have to refer to this as it is underlined. of the brain. Or you can write cardiac center, it doesn't matter which one you put. We wrote coordination via the medulla oblongata, so we would get that mark. And the second marking point says there are increased impulses along the sympathetic/cardiac accelerator nerve. Now, as it said, the S in impulses is underlined. You can't just put increased impulse. You need to write impulses, as multiple impulses are sent along the nerve. So we would get that mark. The third marking point says to the SA node or the sinoatrial node or the pacemaker, as the sinoatrial node is sometimes called a pacemaker. So it doesn't matter which one of these you put, you can still get the mark. We wrote to the sinoatrial node, so we would get that mark. And the final marking point, or the fourth marking point, says more impulses are sent or increased rate of discharge of the sinoatrial node or the pacemaker. And we wrote that, so we would get all 4 marks for this question. And also says here, note, not beats or not speeds up. So if you put any of these terms here, you can't really get a mark as it isn't using proper A-level scientific terminology. So this is the final question, I think. So it says here, explain, so you need to write why something occurs. Explain why increased cardiac output is an advantage during exercise. So this is what I've suggested. In exercise, more energy, or ATP, is released due to a higher rate of respiration. Obviously, you probably already know that high rate of respiration happens in exercise as the demand for oxygen is increased due to the higher rate of muscle contraction. This means that a higher cardiac output leads to an increase in oxygen supply, as increased cardiac output means that more oxygenated blood is delivered to tissues. So a higher cardiac output leads to an increase in oxygen supply to muscles and more CO2 removal. This is important as this maintains aerobic respiration, but you don't need to go into that much detail as this is only a 3-mark question. Right, so this is the mark scheme. So in exercise, there's more energy release, or there's more respiration for actively respiring muscles or for aerobic respiration. So if you refer to respiration, you need to write the word aerobic as it is underlined here. We wrote that more energy is released, so we would get the mark. The second marking point refers to how the higher cardiac output is beneficial for the exercise. So you need to put any 2 of these to get the next 2 marks. So higher cardiac output leads to increases oxygen supply to muscles. We wrote that, so we would get another mark. Or you can write it increases glucose supply to muscles, increases carbon dioxide removal from muscles, and we put that, so we would get all 3 marks to the question. Or you can write lactate removal, or increases heat removal from muscles, or for cooling. So you can put any 2 of these to get the next 2 marks. However, here it says if no increase is mentioned in your answer, you can only get a maximum of 2 marks. Right, that is all I want to say for this video. Thank you very, very much for watching. If you have any questions at all, big or small, please put them in the comments section. I'll be more than happy to answer them, and I'll see you in the next video.